staff and our WPS working group to put on this event today. And before I introduce today's program and our wonderful speaker, I'll share a little bit about the channel with the goal to elevate women's involvement, expertise, and leadership in diplomacy and peace building and in Jewish communal affairs. We launched this channel because we believe it's a key element towards Israel Policy Forum's overarching mission, which is a two-state solution, and mobilizing the Jewish community around a two-state solution, particularly women. As most here know, we believe that a two-state solution and a Jewish, democratic, and secure Israel go hand in hand. And we also know that in the past, negotiations towards a two-state solution have not been successful, although debatably have gotten close. And we're launching this channel because we believe that with more women at the table in peace building and diplomacy, negotiations will be much more successful. And this is not just our opinion. There is a lot of research and information to back this up, including through Georgetown, Council on Foreign Relations, and of course, as Susan highlights in her book. And we're not only focusing only on women at levels of negotiations and diplomacy, but also women in the Jewish community who we want to be advocates for this kind of work and for women's roles in promoting a Jewish, secure, and democratic state of Israel. But our work doesn't stop there. At Atid, in addition to our endeavors to include women on every panel or program that we can, we're cognizant also about diversity. And I'm proud that we include women leadership of diverse religious and ethnic backgrounds, from secular Jewish to Israeli to Persian, in our programs. Having women and diverse women at the table is key to reaching a broader audience. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Susan Sloan, author of A Seat at the Table. This is an extraordinary and impressive book, and I really recommend that everyone read it if you have not thus far. While I currently work for Israel's leading humanitarian aid agency, IsraAid, I previously worked with Susan while at the American Jewish Committee. She is in DC in this role and engages with diplomats, government officials, community organizers, and international leaders. This book, though, is a personal project of hers, so she asked that I communicate that the views shared today are her own. You can learn more about her at susansloan.com or follow her at Real Susan Sloan. And also you can follow Atid at IPF Atid on Instagram, Facebook, etc. And for today's event, you can join us online by using the hashtag #SeatAtTheTable. Please feel free to add your questions throughout the discussion in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. So with that, we'll jump right in. And I want to start broadly with the first basic question. Susan, you very impressively interviewed more than 30 ambassadors, foreign ministers, and government officials. So can we start by you telling us how you came up with the idea for this book, and what did you discover on this journey?
A lot. I discovered a lot. Well, Rachel, first, thank you for having me. And of course, thank you to Shani, Dahlia, and Alex, and IPF Atid for hosting today's conversation. I'm excited to be with you all. We're going to look today at the Israeli conflict through a gender lens, but I want to tell you why this topic interests me and how I got my own seat at the table, especially with this book. I went about writing a book after I finished grad school, and I was looking at the work that I do at AJC, American Jewish Committee, and that I see many global leaders, especially women, having a seat at the table. And I was at a gala event, dressed up, enjoying the black tie affair, and I happened to be at the event that was honoring all women. And it was the first time I was at a Washington event where all the honorees were women, women ambassadors, women military officials, women philanthropists, and it wasn't a women's organization. And the stories touched me, and I thought, who is going to share these stories? Is this just going to happen in a vacuum? So I went ahead and started this journey looking at diplomacy through the lens of gender. However, it became so much more than that. It became about equity, parity, and equality, and why diversity in a whole around the table creates better solutions for the world. So I ended up interviewing, like Rachel said, more than 30 ambassadors, foreign ministers, government officials from around the globe. I'll name some countries: Afghanistan, Albania, Australia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Denmark, Finland, France, Hungary, Iceland, Kosovo, Kurdistan, North Macedonia, Mexico, Namibia, Singapore, Sweden, and of course the US. And one thing that most of these interviews had in common is oftentimes Israel was brought up. And that's one of the few countries that was brought up in many of these conversations. So right now, as we all sit in this pandemic, I am Zooming from my bedroom. You know that social change is happening, whether it's in the United States, whether it's abroad. We are in a particular time of movement within our world. And right now, if you look at the beginning of the pandemic and to where we are today, the countries that have done a better job, they have one thing in common. They've been led by women. Looking at Germany, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Norway, and even Taiwan. We also can learn many lessons from Israel, who has continued to get the vaccine out at record numbers. But what I want to share with you right now is that while it's all great to have a few women at the table, we're not reaching parity yet. When we looked at the 2019 Fortune 500 list, there were around 33 women CEOs. So that's about 6.6%. And only one on that list was a woman of color. Now in 2020, the Fortune 500 list had 37 CEOs on it with 3 women of color. So a little bit of progress. However, when we look at this list of who's leading major organizations in the Fortune 500 list, we can do better. And one of the reasons, and if you zoomed in a little bit earlier, you saw the slideshow going on. One of the reasons why it's important to have women at the table, this comes from the MIT Center for Collective Intelligence, that the collective intelligence of a group rises when there are women involved in that group. And in fact, the more women, the better. So it's also good to have women at the table because of the collective intelligence. But even more than that, foreign policy research states that companies with the highest percentage of women in management are 47% more profitable. 47%. So almost a 50% more profitable. So if you think about diplomacy and business, having women and diversity also hits the bottom line. So gender parity, equity, and equality, it positively benefits everyone. And as you know, that our countries right now are facing so many challenges. We're in the middle of a pandemic. There's huge migration going on in the world. We still have terrorism, climate change, and we have the spread of fast-paced technology. Look at us right now, zooming in from all over the world together. So who is around the table matters. And it's not just a business case. A business case cannot solve diversity, gender parity, or equity. Rather, it's quite personal. And so writing this book, I took these personal stories from these leaders, added research and data to the equation, and I am here to tell their stories and share them with you, and then you will be the owner of the stories, and you have to go share them as well. We need these stories to understand why it's important and what we can do to change the system. So it was an honor to interview these women, and I'm excited to share some of the lessons learned with you today.
Thank you. That was really a beautiful introduction. And I like also that even though you primarily interview diplomats in your book, you also talk about businesses, because the lessons in your book can really be applied to all professional fields, to all types of people. And I also thought that it was really interesting throughout your book, whether you interviewed women diplomats from Kurdistan or Mexico or North Macedonia, Croatia, et cetera. There were many similar themes throughout that I look forward to diving into a little bit more today. And so, you know, for many of us here, it may be a given to include more women at negotiating tables in international relations and diplomacy. Currently, men significantly outnumber women throughout this field. So based on your extensive interviews with diplomats from around the world, first of all, why should we achieve a gender balance in international relations and diplomacy? And what are some qualities that women very uniquely bring to the table?
Well, speaking as a woman, we bring a lot of qualities to the table that are very unique. However, it really is the mix of both men and women. I want to make sure everyone knows that we can't only have one gender at the table. So if it's all women, that defeats the purpose as well. So for all of you men on the call today, or however you identify, we are glad you're here, and I invite you to be our allies for a seat at the table. Uh, Looking at diplomacy and international relations, Rachel, I found out, and many of us who research this field know that participation of civil society groups, including women's organizations, they make a peace agreement about 64% less likely to fail. So when we think about in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, having women, in addition to being at the negotiation table, but in all levels of society. And a story that I'll share with you that shows why thinking from different dimensions is so important to look at a conflict. It comes from Croatia, and you mentioned Croatia. I interviewed the Deputy Chief of Mission, Laura Romano. I'll give a quick plug for who she is so you can understand her background. She grew up in Croatia. She came from a mixed religious family. Her great-grandfather was the last rabbi of Yugoslavia. She wasn't raised Jewish. However, when it was time to graduate from high school and go on to college and some time off, she decided to go to Israel and live on a kibbutz, learn Hebrew, and discover her roots of the Jewish people. She ended up going to university in Israel, and after spending a few years there, she went back to Croatia. She was having a rough time finding a job, as I know many in this pandemic are also having a hard time finding a job. And her father saw an ad in the newspaper asking for people that could speak Croatian and Hebrew because there was a new embassy opening up in Israel. And he said, "You speak Hebrew and Croatian, you should apply to this." And so she said, "Okay, I'll throw my hat into the ring." So she applied. Her background was in art history. She had no plans to go into diplomacy. She ended up getting the job, and she was what's called a local hire. So she wasn't formally a diplomat at first. She was a local hire in the Croatian government. So she went to Israel. She helped form the first Croatian embassy in Israel. And she decided that she liked diplomacy. So she took the foreign service exam, became an official diplomat, and currently she's the Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington, D.C. But one part that she shared with me in her story was her time working in Afghanistan for the elections that were happening, and looking at how she did this with a UN peacekeeping mission, but she became very friendly with the military, the US military that was there, also international groups of people that came together to help with elections. And she realized that there should be multiple levels of diplomacy. It can't just be with the military. It can't just be with politicians. It can't just be with diplomats. It can't just be with civil society. It has to be with all of them. So that's the first level, having all these organizations involved. Second level is knowing who is at the table. Is there a mixture of gender diversity? Is there a mixture of diversity? And what she said to me, she said, "Susan, I can go into these villages without being armed, so they trust me. And the women will tell me what's going on in the ground. I'm invited into their homes, into women's circles, and I'm able to find out the issues that are really happening in their communities." Now, a man can't do that in the same way in certain cultures. A man can go maybe to a circle of men, but he can't go into a home with just women, especially in Afghanistan. So she learned this valuable lesson, and what she ended up doing was briefing the military groups that were in Afghanistan helping with this mission, because she could go inside the villages in a completely different way. So when we think about a conflict, we have to think about all the levels of society that participate. How do we bring those different groups together? And in addition to that, we have to have all genders at the table. And we try to reach for parity, meaning an equal amount of both men and women. In addition to that, when you think from a context of the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are we including different types of Israelis in the negotiation process? Are we including different types of Palestinians? Are we including different religions, ethnicities, socioeconomic status? Are there civil society groups involved? Which ones? Who's sponsoring them? So getting the negotiation table a little bit larger to have these different folks and organizations involved is very important. And one of the reasons why it's so important is that issues that come up in negotiations and in any peace process, they do not include provisions for women and children if women are not at the table. From many different interviews I did, all of them said, if you don't have different voices at the table, they will not bring up these different groups to think about. And when you think about war, the most impacted group are women and children. So we have to include women at the table because we're not going to come up with inclusive solutions unless they're there.
Yes, I completely agree. Couldn't agree with you more. And that's such an important topic that you touched upon, the need for women to advocate for women in civil society, women on the ground, mothers, children. And that was also something that I noticed very consistently throughout your book, that women diplomats from countries of all over the world, probably women who have never met each other, brought up that theme over and over again. For example, I remember reading the ambassador from what is now North Macedonia, but was previously Macedonia, also mentioned the same thing. According, from her perspective, her country hosted in the 90s thousands of refugees from Bosnia, and many of which were women and children. Some men, but she felt the same way, according to your book, the need for really women diplomats to be advocates for these communities, because otherwise their voices are not present at the table. And I'll remind everyone, after this formal Q&A with Susan, we'll take questions. So if you do have any, please feel free to share them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. But I think this is really, really great, excellent food for thought for us to think about and to stimulate an active Q&A afterwards. And I'll ask another question. This is primarily a millennial group today. We are with IPF Atid, the Millennial Leadership Division of Israel Policy Forum. And at least from personal experiences, I believe that our generation is more aware and more understanding about the need to involve more women, about the need to involve more diverse voices at the table, really in any professional field. And I think other generations are starting to understand this as well. But what are concrete steps that governments, NGOs, corporations, and private citizens can take to achieve a gender balance so that it's a norm by the time the next generation, whether it's ours or even the generation after ours, becomes leaders? And I'll start with that.
Well, as a millennial myself, maybe an older millennial, but still a millennial myself, I do find that this generation, in addition to the Gen Z generation, are looking at many things differently than previous generations. But I will say, if you're on this Zoom right now and you are from a different generation that is a little bit older than us, thank you, because you have set the foundation for us to build upon. So if it weren't for your generation, we wouldn't be where we are right now. And at least where we are right now, and we can continue improving. There are definitely many things that our generation can do, especially as we rise in the ranks of leadership. And a story I'm going to share with you right now comes from Australia. I sat down with Ambassador Katrina Cooper. She is the current Deputy Head of Mission at the Australian Embassy in Washington, D.C. She was the former ambassador to Mexico. She was the former senior legal advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Australia. And something she's promoting right now is called the Panel Pledge. And I believe we can all be a part of this. And what it is you can actually go online, Google Panel Pledge. Don't do it right now, stay in the event. But the Panel Pledge is basically a pledge, whether you are a man or woman or however you identify, that you can go and sign on to and say, if I get invited to speak at an event on a panel, the panel has to have gender parity and equity. And you can also look, does it have diversity? You can add that lens to it as well. And if you get invited and the panel doesn't have parity or equity on it, then you can say, I'd love to participate. However, we need to have some diversity on the panel and we need to have more women speakers. Here is a list of women that are competent in this field, in this area. So whatever the topic is, you have a list of people, of colleagues, of contacts that could be a speaker. And maybe it means that you're giving up your seat to someone else. However, that shows how dedicated you are to reaching gender diversity. In addition to that, if you work for an organization that has different leaders and they are often on panels themselves, you can say, hey, so-and-so, how about you sign on this panel pledge? Change happens one person at a time. The more people we have signing on to this, it will create this ripple effect. Now, why is it important to have diversity or gender diversity on a panel? Here's why. It's diversity of thought. Everyone comes from their own lived experiences, from their own viewpoints. However, if we don't have those voices amplified, then we're not going to see a change in the paradigm of discussions, especially in the world of foreign policy. So one thing I love about IPF Atid is that I love that there's diversity of speakers coming from different sections of the Jewish community, different thought leaders, both men and women. However, you can play a part in this. In addition to that, let's say you're at a team meeting for an organization you work for, and you're discussing, maybe you are at a nonprofit and there's an honoree event, or maybe you're at a for-profit organization and they're discussing speakers to come in. Look at that list. Is there gender parity? Is there diversity? What kind of speakers are we having give knowledge to our organizations? That is crucial, because who we are promoting as an organization matters even more. What values are we showing to our employees, our staff members? So you can say to leadership, I want to see this. And millennials, we can be outspoken. We can say things that matter to us. One thing I mentioned in the book in the beginning, that millennials and Gen Z, we're a generation that we value above everything else, this work-life balance. I believe that's also going to be changing, where we also value diversity at the table. So with this shift, there are things you can do. In addition to this Australian panel pledge, which now is going across the United States, and Ambassador Cooper asked me for every event, she says, can you mention the panel pledge? And I said, yes, I can mention the panel pledge. So I have mentioned it officially. Another thing I learned from her, when she rose in the ranks of leadership and she made it to, we'll call it the C-suite of the ministry, the top leadership of the ministry as the senior legal advisor, she looked around the leadership table and there were very few women. And she thought back to her incoming class of diplomats, and it was really a parity. She said it was basically 50-50 men and women. She wondered, where have all the women gone? And she started looking at the list of managers and supervisors and heads of departments, and the women were not there. So she started having discussions with her colleagues, and she asked, how can we change this? How can we change the shift in the foreign ministry? Because we need to have women in diplomacy. And what she heard back is you have to get the leader on board. So at the time, there was a secretary, Peter Varghese, similar to the Secretary of State, Secretary of the Foreign Ministry in Australia. And she went to him and said, we have to do something about our gender diversity at the table. And he looked around and said, oh, you're right. Wow, we are missing the women. Okay, well, this is great you're interested in that. How about you take care of it? You handle it, do something, and I'll support that. She pushed back and she said, no, this has to come from you. This has to come from the top of leadership to show how important it is. So that's your first lesson, getting the leader on board. So what they did is they hired an outside consulting company to come in and look at the foreign ministry and see the disparities of who was rising the ranks of leadership, who wasn't, why there wasn't this gender diversity within the organization, especially in leadership, and what they could do to change that. And so what they found is that to reach significant cultural change, you have to be at the percentage of 40% men, 40% women, and then 20% either. So that 40-40-20 breakdown is the secret sauce to how to reach significant cultural change. So if you think from an Israeli lens, looking at the Knesset, what is the breakdown of gender? What is the breakdown of religious groups? Not just Jewish religious groups. What is the breakdown of ethnicities? If there was 40-40-20, wouldn't that be interesting? How would we look at the conflict a little bit differently? So this idea from Australia, this 40-40-20 to create significant cultural change, is what they decided to do. However, they didn't do quotas. Many people ask me, hey, should we be doing a quota or a target? And from Australia, what they decided to do was targets. And they said quotas, if you list a quota of how many different people you need for a certain group to be at your table, you may get unqualified people. You may put people not in the right positions because you're trying to reach that quota. However, a target, that's aspirational. So if you don't hit that target, it's okay. You can maybe hit it next year. So what they did is they did a tiered target. They said, by this year, we're gonna have 30% women in leadership. By this year, we're gonna do 35%. And by this year, we're gonna try to get that 40%. The first year, they actually didn't make their goal. They were a little bit down from that 30%. However, the next year, they did reach that 35%. And then a year ahead of time, they reached that 40%, which was amazing. And then at the leadership table, things started shifting. They started looking around the foreign ministry and they realized we need to change physically what's in the foreign ministry. And so you may not think this is that important. However, think to organizations that you've worked for or offices you've been in, the physicality of the space. What they realized, looking at all their conference rooms in the foreign ministry, that all of the rooms were named after either men or flowers. Men or flowers, how ridiculous, right? And so they said, we're gonna change this to all the flower names are gonna be named after influential diplomats and leaders who are women. In addition to that, they got pictures, photographs of who they were naming the room after, and a bio of why that person was important to Australia. So when you walked into a room, you knew why that room was named after those people. In addition to that, they looked at the artwork around the building and realized that a lot of the artwork was either done by men or it was photos of men. So they scoured the archives, literally the basement of the foreign ministry, Ambassador Cooper said, and they found historical photographs of women in foreign relations. When they couldn't find a historical photograph, what they did is they kept the history of the organization, of the foreign ministry, and they also had current photos of who's leading the foreign ministry. And this idea is that keeping history while also staying contemporary, that's the great mix. So when people walk through the doors, they can literally see themselves there. I know that there's so many times I've walked through an organization where I've looked at all the organization's presidents, and there are sometimes are very few women, or no women. And I think to myself, I don't see myself here, literally. So what can we do to bring diversity to the table, to bring gender to the table? We have to see ourselves there. We also need to create flexible work hours. When we think about work-life balance for the millennial generation and Gen Z, with work-life balance, what kind of work life are we creating? Is there flexibility of when we work and where we work? That's what millennials, they want to see. And in diplomacy, in different foreign ministries, this is changing too. So I want you to remember those two things, the panel pledge and that 40-40-20 breakdown. And those two things, I want you to mention them to somebody else today. Tell them, I went to this event with IPF Atid, it was amazing. And I want to let you know, we're signing on to the panel pledge. And we're doing this 40-40-20 breakdown on our board. That's going to happen today.
I am so glad you mentioned both of those things, and can very proudly share that at IPF Atid, we actually have made the pledge to include women on our various panels. As many here know, we have incredible events all the time with speakers focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, two-state solution, Israeli society as a whole, and we're very proud to bring in women voices from all sorts of diverse religious and professional backgrounds. And now actually I'll just give a plug. On May 6th, we actually do have another IPF Atid event featuring our very own Dr. Shira Efron and also Hussein Ibish. So we can put that link in the chat for those who would like to join us again on May 6th. And this has all been very, very insightful. I see we have some questions in the chat, so I will take those. I see we have one from Jennifer Steinberg, and I'm really glad the theme of this question is on mentorship, because you do touch a lot on that in your book. So Jennifer asks, on the topic of mentorship and bringing more women into this field, I believe, are there any formal mentorship programs for women in the diplomatic community? And the women diplomats you interviewed, did they seek out mentors? Do they seek out mentors and mentees?
Well, great question, Jennifer. Thank you for asking it. In the book, as Rachel said, I discuss mentorship and weave it throughout the book. There isn't one single way that a diplomat receives mentorship. What I do find is that typically, all of the women in the book had someone a little bit older than themselves with more experience that they befriended through work and that helped them on their journey. However, when I look at all the different advice that they got, there's one particular story that stands out to me. This comes from the Honorable Mary Beth Long. She was the first woman Assistant Secretary of Defense. So it's very high up in the Pentagon. It's equivalent to a level of a 4-star general for the civilian rank. And she originally started her career in the CIA, and her cover was the State Department. She was based in Latin America in a very machismo culture, in a very machismo time. These are her own words. And she said that it was very challenging to get good assignments because she was one of the very few women working in this role. However, an older and more seasoned person in her team befriended her. And he told her, you have something very unique. You're different than everyone else. You can use that. And what he told her, and I love this story, it's very poetic. He said, Mary Beth, when you walk into a room, music plays. Similar to if Arnold Schwarzenegger walks into a room, certain kind of music plays. And a different music plays when Danny DeVito walks into the room. It's not the same music. He said, your music is very different than a man's music. Don't try to be a man's music. Be your own music. Create your own score and use it. And don't be afraid to let that music play. And so what she started doing is going to different events, making contacts that she needed to do, seeking people out, getting meetings. And her colleagues were so surprised she was getting all of these meetings and connections that they weren't getting because she listened to her music. her mentor also told her that when you are looking at your career, when you are looking to rise in the ranks of leadership, you don't need to attach yourself to a star. And what that means is not a celestial star, but a star in whatever field, a superstar in the field that you're working in. That person may not bring you up with them. Who you want to work for, who you want to attach yourself with, who you want to learn from are people that are going to train you, they're going to value you, and they're going to positively reinforce you. Those are the jobs to take, not the jobs with the fancy titles and sometimes the very large salaries, but the jobs that you can actually learn from and grow from. And you want to have a supervisor or a boss that you respect and that you can learn from and that supports you. And that's worth way more than working for a superstar or the fancy title. All of these women I interviewed, which now that when I think back, I'm like, wow, that was pretty amazing. I got to interview all these women. Each of them said, Susan, I'm giving you my story and I want other people to know it and to use it. And one diplomat said to me, this book should serve as its own mentorship guide. When people are looking for a mentor in diplomacy or really in any sector, they can learn something from reading your book. So they can take that as their personal mentorship guide. And so many people that reached out to me after reading the book said, this is like having my own mentor that's from around the world. It's like this global mentorship. So if you want to think of the book as its own mentorship program, you can. So I hope you get a chance to read the book and learn more about these different stories that can help you in your own career journey. One thing I will say, when you think about mentorship, and if you have a mentor, if you're seeking out a mentor, it has to be a two-way street. That means it can't just be what somebody can give to you. What are you offering to them? And I'll tell you a secret. When I was working on this book and reaching out to these different leaders, there's times that I didn't have any contact with these certain people. And so I tried to offer them something. So you want to give something before you receive it. And what that means is if they've written an article, if they were on a podcast, if they were at an event and spoke, you can reach out to them and say, I loved you at this event. I shared the video, or I love this article. I sent it out. I put it on LinkedIn. Let them know that you were promoting them. Let them know that you were helping them. And then more likely, they'll be able to help you. That creates this relationship. In addition to that, once you do have a mentor, stay in contact with them. Let them know what is going on in your life and find out what is going on in theirs. So reach out to your mentor quarterly, or maybe annually, maybe biannually. Figure out your time that you want to do that. Maybe you send them a holiday card. Shoot them a text or an email. Have a time that you reach out and have a phone call with them. And also find out how you can help them. When they've offered their advice, when they offer lessons, or they give you professional guidance, always ask, is there anything I can do for you? Is there anything I can help you with? You've been so helpful to me. It's got to be a two-way street. In addition to that, once you are at the table, you're at a position of leadership, who are you training? Who are you teaching? Who is learning from you? Who are you giving back to? If you don't have other people that you're giving back to, then you're not completing that mentorship circle. So think about that. Maybe it's an intern on the team. Maybe it's reaching out to the alumni association at your university and saying, hi, I'd like to give out my information to 5 students who want to be in the field of X, Y, or Z. Think about ways that you can give back too, because the best feeling is to know that you help someone learn and you help someone grow. And I believe that's why people end up being mentors. And it may not be a formal thing. I have many mentors in my life, and I may not call them my mentor. But one thing I learned in grad school, which I love, is that everyone can have their own personal board of directors, your own strategic advisors. Who is sitting around your own leadership table? Who's guiding you and helping you? Maybe your parents are on that board. Maybe it's one of your best friends. Maybe it's some colleagues from work. Maybe it's a former boss. Think about your own personal board of directors. How do you build that board? Not everyone may stay on the board forever. And you may bring new board members in. Maybe you only have 4 board members. Maybe you have 10. But cultivate that. Those are your group. That's your group of strategic advisors. And you can think about it a little bit differently. What are you giving back to the board? What is the board giving to you? So those are some options to how to seek out mentors and also how to be a mentor yourself.
That's all very helpful and inspiring. And I love that you refer to this mentorship as a circle, the idea of receiving and also giving. And I'll say also that a key part of our WPS channel is to bring in various mentorship and guidance opportunities. So that's why we are very appreciative that we could bring you in today. This is all very helpful advice, and I'll reiterate and echo for those who have not yet read Susan's book. I completely recommend it because the advice in there is very, very valuable from diplomats from all over the world. I see we have another question from Rebecca Grossman. Regarding work-life balance, is there space for the positions of leadership to change to accommodate women holding those positions who still spend evenings with their families and sleep well and have personal time, while still providing their leadership and skill set and connections to the global stage? I think this is also a very important question, especially now during COVID-19, which has significantly affected women in the workforce.
Well, first, thank you for the question, Rebecca. And work-life balance is something we're all trying to achieve. There's even 2 or 3 chapters on that in the book, work-life balance and how to do it all. Yes, to answer your question short, yes. I do believe that there is space for leadership and accommodating people with families. And families can mean anything, right? Whether you're a man or a woman or however you identify, it doesn't just have to be women. Maybe you don't have children. Maybe you have aging parents. Maybe you have a sick sibling or a cousin. We all generally come from families or have some kind of obligation where there are significant people in our life that we sometimes need to help. And how do you have that balance to help others that are close to you, in addition to how do you also have balance even for yourself? There are a few things I will talk about. First thing is the ability to say no, which I know many women have trouble doing. The ability to say no is very important. As you get older in your career, you find that it's really the chances you can't say yes to everything. Early in your career, you want to say yes to everything. You want to go to all the networking events. You want to go to all the meet and greets. You're trying to grow your career. And at a certain point, once you've gotten to a certain level, you have to start saying no and strategically saying no. You don't have to be rude to say no, but you can say, can't do that at this time. However, if you're invited to an event or invited to a dinner with certain colleagues and you need to spend time with your family, you want to spend time with your family and you don't want to go, there's something a little extra special that you can do. Maybe they go out to dinner, not in COVID times. Maybe they go out to dinner. Maybe you have the restaurant send over a bottle of wine or a special dessert and say, wish I could be there with you, sending my regards. Those little things, they're not so much things, they're mentions. And I'll guarantee you this, even though you're not at that dinner, they're all gonna be talking about you. So you are technically gonna be at the dinner. So you have to think about little things you can do that save you time and the ability to say no. I will say that one of the stories from the book that resonates with this topic comes from Sally Painter. She works for an NGO, a non-government organization. She runs a strategic foreign policy organization in Washington, D.C. And she formerly worked under the Clinton administration. When she was working in the administration, she was working for the Secretary of Commerce. She was traveling all over the world on behalf of the United States. She had recently had a very young child. Of course, it was young if you just had the child. But you have to actually read the story in the book because it's actually very humorous and there's some good dialogue in there. So read the story. Here's what I'll tell you. When she was traveling abroad, she missed her son very, very much. And the work was really tough. The work was really long. And one of her own mentors, who was the president of Latvia, said to her, Sally, you can have it all, but you can't have it all at the same time. Learn to how to prioritize. You're traveling abroad, there's all these different embassies you're visiting. See if those embassies have other children your son's age. Have them be with those families during the day and then be with your son at night. There is a way to do this. You have to think creatively. And so many people now are saying, I am going to bring my family into my work life. I'm not going to keep it separate. And something I learned with the flexibility of hours, and many countries are doing this now. Both men and women are saying, I'm going to prioritize my family in a different way. I am going to go to that dance recital. I am going to go to the karate class. I'm going to go to the soccer game. And this is a priority. So yeah, I'm going to leave the office at 3 p.m. And that's okay. And you should too. You have to think about which leaders you are working for. And also how you explain the priorities that you expect to be given at the team. In addition to that, if you take those liberties, you also have to be willing to let your other team members take those liberties as well. You never want to compare somebody who has children to somebody who doesn't have children. You don't know what people are going through, whether they have children or they don't. But there is a way to balance that. I will say that the countries, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, that have many women in leadership, and many women in politics and diplomacy and government, they have two things in common. If you can guess those two things, put them in the chat. 5, 4, 3, 2, no one's guessing. 1, aha, thank you, Brianna, thank you, Jennifer. Family leave and childcare. Those are the two things. Countries with adequate family leave policies, meaning that however you identify, whether you're a man or a woman, you have family leave, especially when children are born or when family members get sick, equal amounts of time. And the cultural norm is that you take that leave. So certain countries that have 6 months, 9 months, and a year, both parents have that leave and are guaranteed their job and guaranteed about 90% of their salary. There's a stigma right now in Sweden and in Iceland and in Finland. If men don't take that leave, it's seen as absurd and ridiculous. You're not taking leave and you're having children. That's the stigma. That's what should be there. In addition to that, once you have children, or if you have different family members that need you, is there care for the people that you can't be taken care of while you work? And so living in a society and creating society, usually working with government, that has adequate, especially childcare, you will see more diversity and more women in the workforce. Family leave and childcare typically impacts a lot of lower income folks, a lot of minorities, and 100% it affects women. 100%. So let's change this paradigm. If you're thinking that your own company doesn't have adequate policies, how can you work with HR? It benefits everyone if you keep people in the workforce, because hiring, firing, all of that, people leaving, it hits the bottom line and it's expensive. If you're able to keep people, do flexible hours, have people come back when they're ready to come back after being with their children or families, that's the way to do it. And we can discuss more offline of different ways, but remember, you can't have it all. You can't have it all at the same time. So figure out these priorities, and we can look at other countries, read it in the book, of what you can do within your organization to make it possible.
Thank you. That's all, again, very helpful. And I will ask the last question because it is somewhat related to what you just spoke about. And I know you do talk about this in your book. How many of the diplomats had children and partners before they started their career?
Great question. There was a mix of women in the book that either had partners before they started their career, did not have partners, met their partners in their careers. There wasn't one single way to do it. Some of the women I interviewed aren't married at all. Some are married and have 4 kids. Some married someone in the foreign service. What is challenging in diplomacy especially, and many diplomats will attest to this, you're moving around the globe. So your partner has to be flexible in location and their own occupation of what they can do if they choose to work. And so it is especially hard on women. It's challenging. Looking at diplomacy though, many people said that when they took maybe a year or two off to go to graduate school, they sometimes found their significant other there. In life though, our world is changing so much in how people meet one another that it's not often necessarily you meet someone in person at an event. Typically now, like we're online right now, people meet people online. So with that, there has to be flexibility in how and when we talk to people, how we court people. And I will say that many of the diplomats I spoke to, whether they were in a relationship, divorced, or seeking a relationship, they told me that having the foundation of family, whether it's immediate family of their own parents and siblings, or a foundation of their own family, of their own spouse or children, that foundation, having that personal group of people that they could rely upon, allowed them to travel all over the world, allowed them to have new experiences because they had that foundation. And so whether you are single, whether you are dating someone, whether you are married to someone, whether you want to be dating somebody, who is in your foundation, your close group? So since we talked about the mentors of the board of directors, who's in the C-suite in your group? Who is your CFO? Who is your COO? Who are those people that support you the most? And how can you rely on them? I do find that all of the leaders I spoke to, they said that they do make time for themselves. Maybe it's something very simple. Maybe it's a day of no meetings. Maybe it's an evening with no evening events. Maybe it's they're taking time, a week or 2 weeks to be with their family and travel. But they all said that they take time for themselves, and it's crucial in this work. I believe this lesson is important for any sector, no matter what we're doing. All of us can't be working all the time. It's not possible. We're not robots. And so oftentimes when you've done good work, pat yourself on the back, tell yourself you did a good job. And then guess what? Take some time for yourself. It's okay. I give you permission. You have this permission slip right now. In diplomacy, in a government, in the private sector, whatever you do, you have to carve out that time for yourself. Maybe it's 30 minutes in the morning when you read. Maybe it's afternoon, you do yoga. Maybe in the evening, you take a walk. Maybe you do that with your partner or your children, but take that time. Because I will say this, many people that I spoke to in the book said, at the end of the day, when I'm on my deathbed, will I be thinking about that treaty I helped solve? Will I be thinking about this negotiation that I did or bilateral relations with foreign policy? No, I'll be thinking about my loved ones. I'll be thinking about my family. And so that is the cornerstone of anyone's life. And it doesn't matter what occupation you're in. So I challenge you to do something for yourself and spend time with loved ones.
Thank you so much. I think that is a fantastic way to end. Thank you again, Susan, for this enlightening conversation and very concrete values for us as a WPS channel as we move forward with our initiative. I recommend, again, if you haven't, check out susansloan.com. And of course, we recommend her book. You can check out IPF Atid's work at IPF Atid, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. If you'd like to get involved either with this WPS channel or with IPF Atid, please feel free to either reach out to me, to Shani or Dahlia, Alex on the call, and we'd be happy to speak with you further about it. On a programmatic note, as we mentioned, IPF Atid's next installment of the webinar series, Laying the Groundwork for Two States, will be on May 6th, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and will feature Shira Efron and Hussein Ibish discussing expanding Israel's regional integration, and that will be moderated by our Atid leader, Karen Poreh. And you can register at the link that Dahlia just shared in the chat. So again, I'm Rachel Wallace, and we look forward to keeping in touch and to hopefully seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Michelle.
everyone. Thanks
Good to
for
see
coming.
everyone.
Thank you.